welcome to another Bright News discussion. My name is Shannon, and I'm here with a special guest today. Her name is Dr. Elizabeth Weiss. So, Dr. Weiss, how are you doing?
I'm doing very good, thank you.
Good, good. Well, I wanted to start by maybe getting some introductory information about you and your work and sort of your academic career and where that's led to.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'll just start with saying I'm a physical anthropologist, or sometimes what is referred to as a bioarchaeologist. So my area of expertise is looking at skeletal remains in past peoples. Now, I do other work as well, like I look at bone biology, for example. But one of the things that I've done throughout my career, and I got my PhD at University of Arkansas, did my master's and my undergraduate in California, but got my PhD in University of Arkansas, and then I did a postdoc position at the Canadian Museum of Civilization, and then I went on and I got a tenure track position at San Jose State University in 2004, and I stayed there pretty much until my recent retirement, which I'll mention in a little bit. But what I did throughout my years is to try to understand past peoples using skeletal remains and how that then helps us understand not only the past, bone biology, but also ourselves. And so one of the concepts that I look at is whether something is in a specific group. Is that found only in those people, those pre-agricultural people in that side of California, or is it something that is global, or in multiple cultures? Because I believe that once we see whether something is a more universal or specific, we can more easily tease out whether something is biological or evolutionarily selected versus a cultural adaptation. So I try to tease those things out throughout my career. And when I've been looking at skeletal remains, I've been looking at not only, disease patterns, like what diseases they have, but also what they were doing. So looking at things like arthritis patterns, degenerative joint disease, and trying to reconstruct what they were doing, and trauma patterns. So one of my last articles before I retired, for example, was on a bump on the head, which likely resulted from being hit on the head. Usually anthropologists will see an indent in the skull and think, oh, that's because the individual had been hit, which is usually the case. But sometimes you get this other reaction and you actually get kind of a bump on the head, almost like what you would expect in those funny cartoon images that you see in childhood. So I've been looking at patterns of trauma as well. And this led me to all of these areas, led me to understand and appreciate the importance of skeletal remains as a research tool, not only to understand the past, but also the present and human nature. And I therefore wrote a book with co-author James Springer, called Repatriation and Erasing the Past. And in that book, what I do is I look at not only the research of skeletal remains, but we also look at the laws and the ideology that is trying to prevent us from accurately describing what happened in the past. And so one of the things is that there are laws that require the reburial of bones, and repatriation of bones, but there's also an ideology behind that says you cannot say anything bad about certain peoples, and identity politics. And that's where what some of my more recent works have centered around is the censorship of science in these cases. Because of the book, Repatriation and Erasing the Past, there was a huge cancel culture campaign against me. And I ended up actually suing my university because they locked me out of skeletal collections. And I ended up my last year, 2023, 2024, spending my year at Heterodox Academy's Center for Academic Pluralism, which is in Manhattan. And then after that, I settled my case against the university. I sued them, settled my case against the university, and retired. So now I am retired. But I'm still actively writing, researching, and hope that my retirement will actually free me for more interesting stuff.
Okay. Yeah. I'm already just from what you said. I'm already getting a little interested. I'll have to say I'm a anthropology enthusiast myself. More closer to cultural anthropology, social cultural anthropology. But I do. This is something I always wanted to ask an archaeologist, as far as remains and everything, and then we'll get to if we can, this whole thing about censorship in academia, and particularly in the social sciences, which is
Right.
a very problematic, I can assume. But the one thing I wanted to ask is when archaeologists deal with human remains and they have like so they have a skeleton, right? Or a skull or something like that. And say the skull is not completely restructured. It hasn't been
Right.
put together and everything. How are archaeologists able to tell, say, the age of the skeletal remains, the gender, right? And stuff like that. That always seems sort of very strange to me. Like, how are you able to tell if this is a woman or a man, and if they're old or young? Is
Well,
that
I was say that obviously, the more perfect the preservation, the
mm,
easier that is, right? So
okay?
depending on how much you have, you might not be able to tell certain things. Now,
Mm,
we can now take DNA from the inside of the bone to determine certain things.
mm,
But let's say you just have a skull, so you don't have the pelvic bones. If
mm,
you have the pelvic bones, then it's very easy to tell between males and females
okay.
because there's evolutionary changes that occur as a result of females giving birth.
Okay.
Um, but if you have the skull, it's actually not too difficult still for several reasons. One thing is women's skulls are much what we call bossier or smoother. Like
Okay.
we don't have very big brow ridges. But
Okay.
you might say, well, that's kind of like a subjective, but there are things that come out of that that are less subjective. So, for example, if you have a skull and you take your finger and run it from the inside of the eye socket to the outside,
Mhm.
the difference will be with a female, it will be much sharper. It will be a sharper feel, and with a male, it will be much smoother or rounder. Um,
Okay.
in the
Let me
back,
try it.
in the back, you might feel like you have like a little bit of a hook or something. We
Hmm.
call it the iliac hook.
Hmm.
Um, that is much more pronounced. Sometimes you call it a nuchal hook, much more pronounced in males than in females.
Okay. Hmm.
Um, the hard part behind your ear, the mastoid,
Hmm.
is tends to be almost double the size in males than in females. So some of it is just size related, right?
Okay.
Um, but then there are also things like the chin. If you have the jawbone, males sometimes get this triangular pronunciation
Mhm.
um, that we don't tend to see in females.
Mhm.
So all of these things take, each one of them could be wrong, but taken as a whole, you
Mhm.
were pretty good. We're about 80 to 90% accurate if you have the skull. Now, if you have this pelvis on top of it, you're almost 100%. It's one of the things we do best, determining males versus females. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't going to be some individuals who we can't do it for because we're not perfect at assessing these things.
Mhm.
It doesn't mean that there aren't some people who have chromosomal disorders like Klinefelter syndrome, where that actually do affect the bones and therefore would make it difficult to assess. But what's interesting is because anthropologists also look at diseases, they know what to expect when they look at a skeleton with some of these chromosomal disorders. And so we can say, well, this person must have had that disorder, and that's why it's difficult to determine the
Right.
sex. So,
Right.
but the aging is a little bit more tricky. Um, it's very easy to determine. I'm talking about like how old someone is. So like I'm 50 years old. So like age in that way, as opposed to antiquity, how ancient something is. But
Okay.
aging is a little bit more difficult because when you look at um, when you look at skeletons, when people are growing up, it's actually quite easy because dental eruption is very genetically controlled, so it's not affected by environment very much. So we can look at dental eruption to see like, was this person 10 or 11 or 14 to 15, right? Things like that. And not only dental eruption, but the formation of the roots and, so that, I mean, the teeth are excellent tools to determine young age.
Okay.
Um, and then throughout the skeleton, there are fusion patterns. So basically when your bones fuse, you stop growing. So
Mm.
you can look at that. And the last bone to fuse is the clavicle. So your your clavicles right here, your collarbone.
Right. Okay.
And that fuses later in males. It sometimes fuses like at age 35 or so in males.
Well,
Um,
okay.
and that's why you see like young males, like 20-year-olds, 25-year-olds, they oftentimes still are more slightly built. And then they get to their 30s and they get these broad shoulders because their clavicles are continuing to grow. So
Yeah.
these kind of effects. But once you get past all the bones have fused, then it becomes very difficult to tell how old somebody is. There are sutures on the skull that some people will say can be used, but there's a huge amount of variation. Tooth wear is varies greatly by culture. So it's very hard to tell if somebody is like 50 versus 60. I
Right.
always told my students, if you found my bones, you probably couldn't figure out whether I was 30 or 70. And then,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
there are some things that occur really late in life, like arthritis is more often in older people. But in past population, arthritis started early. So because it was linked to this hard labor. So in a sense, it's not a really good, it's a good indicator that this person was a full adult, but it's not a good indicator whether they were 50 or 60, right? So, um, and so that's one of the really interesting things. And it's one of the things I think anthropologists really still need to work on and why the retention of skeletal collections is so important and varied skeletal collections, everything from ancient remains to forensic collections. Because everything that we learn as anthropologists and archaeologists dealing with the remains has direct applicable application to forensic cases. And so these are things that are not just scholarly, they're also real life applications.
Right.
Some of the One of the interesting things is like if you think about some of the most devastating events in the recent U.S. history, like 9/11 or the Waco, the Waco deaths, Waco, Texas, Branch Davidians. In both of those cases, they needed anthropologists to come in to identify victims. So anthropologists work at identifying prisoners of war. So I
Yeah.
think that this is one of the things that people sometimes, oh, what if anthropology folds? It's not, it's just a, mind games type thing, but it's not, it's actually has real world applications as well.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So with that, let's maybe we could transition to the
Okay.
sort of the problems in academia and sort of the politicization of anthropology and using say forensics and everything. So you know I listened to some of your talks in previous YouTube podcasts that you gave about how, some of the remains, even if they were like predate, say, a certain tribal classification, say, you might say like, okay, the I'm just thinking here, maybe the Tlingit or the Kwakiutl here in the Northwest, and say,
Right.
well, we don't want you taking that skull or those remains, from this place or something like that because it's sacred ground, or, or you need to bury it in this place because it's sacred ground. You know, how much does that sort of hinder, archaeology as an academic study? If everything is supposed to be sort of treated as sacred, but it's like, well, what am I supposed to do? I can't study. So what do I do with
So
that?
basically, in 1990, the
Mm,
federal law, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Law Act, was passed,
mm,
and it's the acronym is NAGPRA, and basically that required museums and universities to give skeletal remains and certain artifacts, funerary objects,
mm,
and sacred objects to back to tribes.
mm,
And it was a compromise
mm,
because the concept was not that you would be giving the all remains back. You would be giving back remains only that were clearly linked to a modern tribe. And so this was many historical collections,
mm,
but anthropologists in general felt that it was the right move. And they felt that it was a good compromise because they realized that there were many collections that had no clear affiliation because tribes change over time. They wipe each other out. They engaged in warfare. Some of them died out. Some of them merged. Some of them became so assimilated that they're really no longer Native American, and so forth. And this happens all over the world. It's not just Native Americans that
yeah,
engaged in these activities, of course. And so what happened was um, almost all of the historical collections uh, that were clearly linked to Native American tribes had been reburied, or repatriated. Um, and the difference is, a tribe can decide not to rebury it and can hold the collection in their own museum or so. Most of them do rebury. But the thing is that once that ended, it wasn't over because many activists, and Native American activists and academic activists, said, well, there's all these skeletal remains still in the museums and universities. These need to be repatriated. And those are the ones that are being repatriated now, since the others have already been done. Um, and this was never the purpose for NAGPRA. The purpose was to make a clear link between a tribe and a collection. Now, I'm against all repatriation because I think that we lose so much when we lose skeletal remains. And I don't believe in the concept of sacred. And I know other people do, and I know there are religious sensitivities, but would hope that someday we would get to the point where we say, it's more important to have the data than to practice the religion. And perhaps we can practice religion without losing the data. And
mm,
if you think of it in a sense, we've done this before. um, Catholics used to be super against organ donations. Italy had huge problems with organ donations, but there has been changes, and we accept that this is such a good thing to do that people have said, well, it can't be against God's will if they believe in God. So I do think that there could be a way to move forward to that. But instead, anthropologists have just kind of said, well, you know what, we should just give everything back. And anthropologists too have become activists. The new generation of anthropologists are not that interested in understanding the past as opposed to understanding, identity politics.
mm,
So I do think that that's a problem. And so what I suspect is that in the next 10, 20 years, we will see the loss of all collections.
Mm.
And we don't have the replacements. So for example, forensic collections, so like if you were interested in studying forensics to learn about bone and bone biology and identification of those who died, um, almost all of the big collections are not diverse. They don't have people of different backgrounds, like, they're almost all whites who have donated their bodies. But it's not only, you know, ethnicity, it's also they're almost all male, they're almost all adult. And like, so it's like um a very narrow range of human diversity. And one of the things I love is understanding that, and showing people how diverse the bones are. We
Yeah.
we're used to seeing diversity, between people with living people, but like so many times throughout my 20 years teaching osteology, my bone class, students would be like, "Oh, what's this? Is this some kind of disease or something?" Like, no, that's just normal human variation. And that's kind of a beautiful aspect of learning about the skeletal remains, is to know that our human variation, it is goes beyond just the superficial and
Yeah.
goes straight to the bone. And I think that that's something that's being lost. So what's
Yeah.
happening now is in California, basically all collections that may be Native American are off limits, but not only off limits for research, for teaching, for display. So professors are being told in certain universities that they cannot use slides that they did, PowerPoints with images of these things, that this is off limits too, and the data are off limits. And so I feel like we are heading towards a very dark time when we cannot look at skeletal remains.
Yeah.
Now, some people would say, well, why can't you just study them or scan them and 3D print them and then give the bones back? Well, what we've seen even recently is that once that is done, then they come back. The activists come back and say, we want the scans too. We want the photos too. At my own university, they're planning on burning all the x-rays that were taken. They've re-identified these x-rays as being sacred, and they plan to burn them. So I am very skeptical that compromise can ever be reached.
Yeah.
And I think that this is a huge loss. And it's not just a loss for people like me, like anthropologists, but it's a loss for, museum goers. 2024 saw the shuttering of museum exhibits all over the nation and abroad. Um, and this is where a lot of children get their like the first wisp of intellectual curiosity about the past. So I think that it goes beyond just the academic halls.
Yeah. Yeah. I wonder where the sort of, what's the word to use, where the sort of the desire to sort of push for that came from. So I'll give you sort of an example. Maybe, you say, like, when anthropology sort of in the Anglosphere started to take on a real, like, take on a more academic nature. In the beginning, a lot of those guys were like chair historians and stuff like
Yeah,
that.
yeah,
Like James Frazier. They wanted to read the myths and do compare and contrast and stuff like that. And perhaps maybe over time, people started to feel like the field of anthropology, in academia, was too um, white supremacist. That
right.
it was too many white men who spoke the King's English or something like that, that didn't understand other groups of people. They thought of everybody as sort of the noble savage, or like the barbarian. So now there's this sort of pendulum shift, like in the other direction, where it's like everything that was done in the, early, say, 20th century or something like that needs to be reversed. Like we gotta just, so when you talk about like like even the scans, even the 3D printing scans and all of that needs to be returned to, it's sort of that extreme,
Yes.
shift. Like
I
we're
think
going in the total other direction. Yeah.
I think there is a lot of guilt
Mhm.
that
Mhm.
anthropologists have because of the because of some links to um, like eugenics or a
Mhm.
racist scientific racism. But
Mhm.
I actually think that um, when people have when science is misused by,
Mhm.
say, like during the Nazi times.
Mhm.
Um, I don't actually think it's a science to be blamed. I
Mhm.
actually think that regardless of whatever the scientist said,
Mhm.
Hitler would have still targeted the Jews.
Mhm.
I think that that's, I don't see that because what you have is you have people fitting the whatever it is that they want into their narrative, which is not science.
Right.
What science is looking at the data and trying to figure out what it's saying, not having a preconceived notion.
Mhm.
And so, um, you know, I wish that anthropologists would more fully embrace the good aspects of our past. Every field has something negative about their past. There's not a field that is untouched. I mean, I think it's quite interesting that Margaret Sanger, who started Planned Parenthood, was a huge eugenicist, and yet
Yeah.
she seems to be getting off scot-free. So it's like, because anthropologists also, very early on, um, Jewish anthropologists entered into academia. Some of our earliest academic anthropologists were Jewish. They testified at the civil rights hearings. They were key in showing human diversity, and constructing the concept of cultural relativity to an extent. You
Mhm.
don't want to be like, you need to have cultural relativity, meaning that you can't judge every culture in the same through the same lens, but
Right.
you can say, well, some things are not good and some things are better. you
Yeah.
know so
Mhm.
anthropologists did all this really great stuff,
Mhm.
um, and yet uh, they're not getting any of the credit for it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I do think that we should be less focused on presentism, on like, looking at, oh, well, was he a sexist because he said certain things about women, as opposed to what was it in his time period, was he progressive or not?
Mhm.
And he was.
Mhm.
So you can't really judge people by our standards. You have to judge them by their standards. And if, you know, that's the other aspect of that. So
Yeah.
both misuse and misunderstanding of the past.
Mhm.
I think so. I do think that's part of it, that this kind of guilt. And I think we need to not feel guilty for things we have not done.
Yeah.
um, and
Yeah.
then the other thing is, I think we need to return to the concept of like objective knowledge. Data is apolitical, and that we're just looking at the data to reconstruct the past. And if you don't put like a presentism lens over the past, then you
Mhm.
can look at people's activities without judging them. And so, for example, a lot of um, Native American activists don't want to admit that they replaced other peoples, so that one tribe replaced another, or that they were engaged in violence, or
Yeah.
that and the answer is, well, not to hide that fact, but to say, well, that's human nature, and therefore there's nothing wrong that happened, and we've moved forward in some ways, and in some ways we're still the same, but you know, um, but not that we can only do that if we look at the past through a more objective lens.
Mhm.
So I do think that that's another aspect of it.
Yeah.
But the other thing is, I think that it's easy to, sit here scolding past anthropologists as opposed to doing the work, as opposed to learning the 206 bones, and as opposed to learning the statistics. And so I do wonder how much of it is just that, as universities expanded, let a lot more people in, that we
Mhm.
get people who are not as dedicated to actually intellectual endeavors,
Mhm.
um, and genuine curiosity,
Mhm.
are entering in the field, and they're like, oh, well, this is easy. All I have to do is bash this white guy from 200 years ago.
Yeah, yeah.
So I
Yeah,
think that that's another aspect of it.
yeah.
Yeah, so all this goes together.
Yeah, that's interesting that you brought that up. The whole thing of, the sort of tribal rivalries, with each other and stuff like that. And that ties into this whole thing of slavery, right? Where,
Right.
you know, you, and I'm gonna try to be delicate with this because, even though I'm a black guy, I can still be critiqued for saying something off kilter, but I don't, whatever, I'm gonna say it anyways. This whole idea that like Europeans were the only ones to like take slaves from Africa over the Atlantic, bring them here, force them into the labor, and forced labor and stuff like that. I would never say like I condone that, you know what I mean,
Of
or anything
course.
like that, right? And and I have my own sort of arguments for why I think we stop doing that, and why we, really try, especially in the West, why we really try to abolish that practice. But it's you think about like, okay, slavery was commonplace throughout the world. Like everybody pretty much did that. And I
Yes.
don't understand why we try to sort of, scapegoat a particular group. Maybe we find it easy to do that because it makes us feel better about our own group or
Yeah.
something like that. I mean, I don't,
It's
what,
hard, it's really
yeah.
hard to say why we're not celebrating the end of slavery. And I know there are still pockets of this world that have slavery or practical slavery. I'm
Mhm,
not saying that there aren't,
mhm,
but we went from a we went from a world that was full of slavery to one where there's just pockets of it. This is
mhm,
a cause for celebration.
mhm,
And,
mhm,
you know, the transatlantic slave trade was a horrific thing.
mhm.
Um, the, you know, but one of the reasons why it was possible was because the Africans, who in were also engaged in the
Yes,
slave trade, and so they were
yes,
trading each other.
yes.
Um, but that didn't only happen in Africa. That
Yeah.
happened in what is now Eastern Europe too.
Mhm,
The
mhm,
the, the term Slavic,
mhm,
slave comes from the term Slavic about Russia, Eastern Europe, Russia, so forth,
mhm,
had slaves too.
mhm,
Um,
mhm.
and they would I remember reading one ethnography, and it was like, well, in Russia, you could you could buy your way out of slavery, but nobody ever did. Right? So like there was a concept of it, but quite honestly, nobody ever did because
Right.
you know
You
um,
can't afford it.
you can't afford it. You're not getting any money for your labor. Yeah.
Right,
So or so little that it's not not going to happen.
right.
So there was debtors, slaves who became slaves because of debt. The
Mhm,
North America and South America was had slavery from like the Northwest coast to all the way to Florida. I mean, one of the things is that when Europeans arrived in the Americas, and the slave trade started in the like 1619. Um, One of the things was that the Cherokee, you know, basically helped along because they had already known about slavery, were engaging in slavery.
mhm,
Um, I think at like at the time in 1830 to 1860, like 17,000 Cherokee had like 4,000 slaves, which is a huge amount. Um, and so there was, there's things like that. Um, uh, we see like modification of the skull, right? So head wrapping and
Mhm.
flattening was
Right.
used by tribes of the Pacific Northwest as ways of saying, well, those people who don't do that, they're not really human, and therefore we can enslave them. So like these are kind of
Wow.
things were happening.
Yeah.
Um, and some people would say, well, it wasn't quite the same type of slavery because it wasn't chattel slavery.
Right.
And it's like, well, sometimes it was,
Yeah.
but other times it was like, well, you're kind of splitting hairs because,
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
the Northwest coast, for example, they had potlatches,
Uh-huh.
and the potlatches were banned by missionaries when they
Right.
came in because
Right.
one of the things is that in a potlatch, two groups would come together, two chiefs would come together, and they would try to outgive each other gifts
Get the
to
get
show
the
off their
yeah, now that's something that Melanowski, I think he talked about
yes,
gift
right.
giving, the exchanging of gifts.
The exchange
Yeah,
of gift
okay.
to show, look how rich I am.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
one of the things that they would bring is they would bring slaves. And
Okay.
they would be like, look how rich I am. I have all these slaves. I'm just going to kill them right here to show you that I don't even need them. So
Wow. Wow.
this was like normal practice. Of course, the Muslim slave
Mhm.
trade
Mhm.
from the century to the 19th century was another example. So,
Yes.
and I think all of these examples are awful.
Yeah.
I'm not, there's no condoning slavery of
Mhm.
any
Mhm.
people.
Sure. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
that, in a sense, understanding that it was worldwide
Mm.
means that you can stop just blaming one people
Yes.
and start celebrating the progress, which is
Yes.
how I like to see it. It's
Yeah.
the same thing with like other types of behaviors, like violent behaviors. We
Mhm.
don't, I mean, one of the things is that when we talk about the US being on stolen land,
Mhm.
well, Europeans actually came and bought land. And you
Mhm.
could say, well, the Native Americans didn't understand that. Um, and there's debates about how much they understood or what. But one of the things is that prior to the selling of the land to Europeans, what Native Americans did was they basically ran each other off land that they would in violent ways.
Mhm.
There's not a, you know, the collection that I curated for nearly 20 years it's called the Ryan Mound, and it's from the San Francisco Bay Area. And the date is, was large collection, and it had the date range from like 2,800 about years old to about 250 years ago. So it's a site that was accumulated over many years, and um,
Yeah.
and there's about 10% of the individuals have evidence of interpersonal violence. And I think that's just from the bones. So you're undercounting it because you're not counting all the flesh wounds and so forth. But like literally like arrowheads sticking out of the skull
Yeah.
or embedded in the bones of
Mhm.
the back, the vertebral bones. And when I looked at this, and I was like, wow, I've been told that this is only one people throughout the whole time. This
Mhm.
seems odd. And then I started looking at the skeleton, the skull's features, and I noticed that they actually were different people. So they were replaced. This is not to say, oh, those bad Native Americans,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know, how dare they replace others? This is to
Yeah.
say that that's human nature.
Right.
Just
Right.
like when we first left Africa, we replaced the archaics who were in Europe.
Mhm.
And, then there were other movements out of Africa. And
Mhm.
this happened over and over again until some people said, wait, why don't we settle this in a different way? And then
Mhm.
you get land purchases. And
Right.
I think that that was actually progress.
Mhm. Yeah.
would we really want to still be in a land, in a situation where you're in a nice home and somebody is like, says you can't stay here, I'm pushing you out.
Yeah, yeah,
I mean, we
yeah.
still have that sometimes. It's called eminent domain, but at
Yeah.
least it's kind of more controlled then.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And that now that's what leads me to this to my thing about Rene Girard, and he himself was not a anthropologist or trained anthropologist. He was he academically he was a historian and then a professor of uh literature, literary criticism and French literature and stuff like that. But he did write this book, Violence and the Sacred. And, on throughout his life, he kind of carried on with this interest in anthropology and how it, relates to like humans and why violence is carried out amongst many different groups. And, so he was able to see that like this comparing, I forget which one is called ethnography or ethnology. I don't remember which one, but the comparing of cultures where you could see like well, they all kind of do these violent things, and then they all even sometimes they will make the violence sort of sacred. That
Right.
like that their violent behavior is even like the gods must be demanding this of me, or something like that. And I started thinking about in my mind, like when you talk about, the Native Americans or in Africa, and say even in you know, pre-Christian Europe and maybe even post-Christian Europe, that, people were always looking to validate their violence, against one another. So they would, this is just my little self assumption that they would say, okay, well, if we go to the gods, if we do this ceremony, we do this thing, the gods will bless us, and then we can go and kill our
Yeah.
rivals, and then even enslave them. You know what I'm saying? And then they'll
Right.
say,
Right.
and then here comes, and so then they'll say, well, the Europeans, well, they took the slaves and they sold them off to. But I said, like you said, the only reason why they were able to do that is because these kingdoms and tribes were actually fighting with one another. And of
Right.
course, they would want to get rid of their enemies. They would say, "Yeah, the more of them we get rid of, the stronger we become." Or
Yeah.
we can absorb them into our tribe.
Yeah.
So
And
yeah,
it's kind
just
of interesting if you look at this kind of global global perspective on violence and on slavery.
mhm,
Um, it used to be that archaeologists thought that like ancient Egyptians
mhm,
had a worldwide impact
mhm,
on throughout the, because we see pyramids in South America and we see pyramids in Egypt, and there's some similarities.
mhm,
And then the, in Australia we have mummification as well, so like, and it's like, oh well, did the ancient Egyptians have this worldwide impact? And
mhm.
the answer is no, they
Right,
didn't. What
right,
happened is that the ancient Egyptians had the same biology in a
mhm,
sense, the
mhm,
same human nature that
mhm.
everybody else did. And
Right,
so there's going to be these similarities. And
right,
ancient Egyptians too had slavery,
yeah,
which they called speaking tools. They called the
wow,
people
okay,
speaking tools. So they didn't see them as human. And I
wow,
think that then when different religions arose, the
mhm,
people did like use religion to kind of justify certain actions.
mhm,
People still do this. Look at the treatment of women in Islam,
mhm,
right? So, in a sense, that's using a religion to treat somebody in a certain way, whether
mhm,
that is, oh, I'm going to treat them in this way because they are a different sex or a different skin color or a different um, you know tribe, doesn't matter. Um, but I don't really blame religion for it. I just think I think it's human nature, and then
yeah,
they look for a reason to do this.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
that goes back to exactly what I was saying with science.
Mm,
You know, when terrible things were done on the basis of science, oftentimes it wasn't really science, it was human nature.
right, right.
Then it looked for reasons to do it, and they would bring, oh well, look at the scientific research. So I
Yeah,
think that that's like cause and effect issue.
yeah.
um and the thing is, like with um this ritualized violence, I
Mm,
think in some ways that it evolved.
mm,
And I know a lot of cultural anthropologists don't like to talk about the evolution of culture anymore,
mm.
but in a way, the early cultural anthropologists like Tyler, who talked about the the evolution of culture. Well, I think they got it right in some ways, where it's like it evolved so that we can now take, for example, if you think about like ritualized violence, boxing,
Mm, mm, mm,
it's a
mm.
kind of, and you channel violence into ways that aren't as harmful.
Yes.
And
Mhm.
so it has this symbolic nature. And
Yes.
so you can see that, maybe that was actually quite good.
Yeah.
But
An
also,
upgrade, huh?
yeah, up here. And also religions change. The Old Testament is much more harsh than the
Yeah.
New Testament.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
that's another aspect.
Yes, it is. Yeah. Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up because and I'll land the plane here, but I'm glad you brought that up because, I would be remiss if I didn't say that Gerard always argued that actually religion, because okay, when I was growing up in high school, this was the early 2000s, we were always taught that religion was the basis of violence for everything. And in particular, Christianity was the religion that caused the most violence. But Gerard, he would argue that no, actually, religion was a way for us to contain our violence, for us to, hone in on it. So what do? We instead of all against all, it's all against one. So we pointed at a victim,
Right,
at a sort of a scapegoat, right?
right, right,
To channel all that violence on, or maybe it might have been a number of people, but it was a select group that you would enact that violence on, and you would say, okay, this is a sacred act because it has allowed us to channel our frustrations, onto one group. And you can kind of see that in the literature of the Old Testament, right? In Leviticus, I think, where it talks about, the laying of hands on the goat, and say, well, like, put all the sins of the community on the goat and then
right.
toss the goat off the cliff or something
Yeah.
like that, or send it out into the wilderness. So yes, I do think that's a very important thing to keep in mind, that, like, yeah, religion actually was a way for us to kind of get out of that.
Yeah, and many religious sects of Christianity are explicitly nonviolent.
Mhm,
They have,
mhm,
the Quakers or the Amish, and
mhm,
it's not to say that this is a perfect solution. Obviously,
mhm,
I'm an atheist, so I don't think it's a
mhm.
perfect solution, but I'm not. but but I do think that it's not the cause of violence. I do think
Mhm,
that it actually reduced violence. And even the missionaries, you
mhm,
know, I mean, in South America, for example, in the Peruvian highlands, when missionaries arrived, they were talking about how there was so much human sacrifice, especially of children.
mhm,
And
mhm,
when anthropologists were reading these missionary statements years later, like in the 70s,
mhm.
1970s, right? They're like, there weren't any human sacrifices. They just made this up to try to convert people and also to try to get more money from Spain. And
Mhm.
I'm not saying that they didn't never exaggerated, never lied. Of course, people do. That's another human trait. But the thing is that in the 80s, they started to find these children who were sacrificed.
Mm,
And they were sacrificed to the gods,
mm,
the mountain gods for better weather or whatever.
mm,
And the Christian missionaries wanted to stop that.
mm,
And so don't think that you could say, oh, well, if we didn't have religion, we wouldn't have violence.
mm,
We had violence before we had any of the main religions,
mm,
just like
mm.
we had slavery before. I think the oldest clear evidence of slavery dates back something like, um, and it's always hard to look at, because in some ways, it's not there's not good there's not written documents in some of the
Mhm.
old ones, but where we see really what we would think of as clear evidence of slavery dates definitely back 6,000 years.
Okay.
So this is you know it, definitely good evidence of it. There's probably was some slavery before that. It's hard to document, because we know that there were, like, if you look at um, if you look at certain cemeteries, there are people who were treated differently. There are people who, had many grave goods versus none,
Right.
and these kind of things could be indicators of not only inequality, but of slavery. And so it's hard to say,
Yeah.
like, I mean, one of the good examples is, the bog bodies of Europe.
Okay. Yeah.
People are like,
Mhm.
what were they? Were they punishments? Were
Mhm.
they, were they witches? Were they criminals? Were they outcasts?
Mhm.
We're not 100% sure. But what we
Mhm.
do know is that the way they were disposed of, their bodies were um, treated, was not the normal way for that age, the Bronze Age.
Okay.
Almost in Europe during that time, almost all of the other remains were burned, were
Okay.
cremated.
Okay.
So they were
Mhm.
treating them differently, but we don't know why,
Right.
so.
Right. Right.
And those
Yeah.
were like the
Okay.
Germanic tribes
Yeah.
who, had, the Vandals
Yeah.
came after that, right? So the
Yeah.
Germanic tribes, and then the Germanic tribes turn into like the Vandals, and then they go down to Tunisia and ransack Carthage,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So it's it
Yeah.
was quite a
Yeah.
wild world.
Yeah, yeah. It was, seems like now we're transitioning into something else wild. I don't know what's going on now. It's
Right.
we used to be able to you used to be able to kind of learn about a lot of different things, and now it seems like we have a lot of this well, like you said, censorship. There's a lot of censorship, and so lastly, I'll ask you: do you think that sort of an interest in anthropology as a field of study for people to, want to go into and everything? Do you think that'll ever sort of reverse? Because now you have this thing where people say, man, if you go into anthropology, you ain't gonna have no job ever. You might as well just let that go and find something else to do. So
Yeah.
I wondered, I mean, what's your assessment on that? What do you think about that?
I think that anthropology has strayed quite a bit, and the departure from its intent. So anthropology's big main intent was to understand people,
Mhm.
right? And
Mhm.
especially people who are different from you, who, whether that is from a different culture or from a different time period. And I think that they've departed and just kind of embraced the identity politics of, and the victim narrative is always right, as opposed to let's really try to understand people. Um, there's a lot of self anthropology of self, um, self ethnographies. I just saw one about, like, uh, someone who wrote about um, her her own experience. Um, her I think it was Yom Kippur. I think it was like her own Yom Kippur experience, which might be
Okay.
really interesting, but it's not anthropology,
Right, right,
right?
right. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
it's like, um, so I think we need to get back into understanding the other,
Mhm.
and once we understand it, once we, get back to that, whether that other is, in the past or the present, I think anthropology would then be able to be saved.
Mm.
Will it be? I don't know. Right now, especially archaeology is really have taken a dive. I just um, presented on the vast censorship that anthropology is facing, where many of the journals are not even allowing photographs of skeletal remains anymore. Um, there's you must get permission from tribes to conduct research. And one of the things is that when you say, people would say, well, what's wrong with that? Why wouldn't you want to get permission? And the problem is because those people you're asking for permission, they are they tend to be activists who are not interested in understanding the real past.
Right, right.
So that's, and like I think there's a difference between talking about, like, okay, Native Americans, you know, many of them are very interested in understanding the past and are interested in archaeology, excuse me, um, and interested in studying archaeology and becoming archaeologists. But then there are the activists, Native American activists, who are like the academic activists, who that's their interest is not in the field, right?
Mm,
So
mhm, mhm,
um,
mhm,
I I'm hesitant to tell people not to study anthropology because anthropology is such a fascinating field. And I
mhm,
remember when I was doing my undergraduate work
mhm,
in UC Santa Cruz, University of California, Santa Cruz. I was like, I don't know whether I'll do anthropology, cultural, physical, or archaeology.
mhm.
And I've
You
I
didn't want
love
to do you didn't want to do linguistics? Then
we yeah, at the time there were no linguists in our department, and
oh,
maybe
okay, okay.
linguists was in a different department, as it is often. So maybe had there been, I would have been like, oh, maybe in linguistics.
Yeah.
But at the time that wasn't like one of the subfields that was at our university, in
Okay.
the anthropology department at least. But
Okay.
then I was like, then I did some field work and I thought that was interesting. I went to Africa and I looked at fossils, and it's like, oh, this is such an interesting field.
Yeah.
I ended up as a physical anthropologist, as a bioarchaeologist, because I love anatomy as well.
Okay.
So
Mhm,
I love, there's something very hands-on about it, and very,
mhm,
I don't consider myself like this really deep thinker. I'm more
mhm.
like, ooh, look at that.
Yeah.
I love how when you look at skeletal remains, you can see, you know, a, a life that had taken place beforehand,
Mhm,
and try to reconstruct that life. Um,
mhm.
and so I would hate people to say, well, I'm not going to look into anthropology because, it's all gone woke.
Yeah.
A lot of fields have gone woke.
Yeah. Yeah.
We actually need
That's
good
true.
students in anthropology to save it. Um,
Yeah.
but I understand that it's difficult to get a job afterwards, and therefore maybe I would say people should double major.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, double major. Yeah, that's a good one. That's a good one. Or, keep it in your heart and always,
Right.
come back to it every now and then. Yeah. All right, Dr. Weiss, I want to thank you for taking the time to talk with me. This has been a really good treat. So I'm sure my audience will really get a kick out of this, and they'll maybe get their wheels turning too. So I
Okay,
appreciate
thank
it.
you so much. Let me plug my book before I leave.
Oh,
I
please.
had a
Yes.
book had a
Yeah.
book come out just last year. It's called
Mhm.
On the Warpath: My Battles with Indians, Pretendians, and Woke Warriors.
Wow.
It
Okay.
talks about all I've been through with the cancellations, but it also talks about anthropology and academia in general. So
Wow. Okay. Okay.
thank
Well,
you
I'm
so
definitely going to
much.
purchase that. That's going to be a spring summer read for me.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you so
Yes.
much for having me on.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Bye bye now.
Okay. Ciao.